Good morning, Ambassador Kamo, Mr. Huffinus, colleagues and students, and welcome to the final video conference of the semester with the United Nations, hosted by the Office of Global Learning here at Fairleigh Dickinson University. The title of today's presentation is The Role of Civil Society in the Post-2015 Agenda, and our guest speaker is Mr. Jeffrey Huffinus, the UN representative of Civicus. I am Dr. B.F. Battistoli, Assistant Professor of Journalism in the School of Art and Media Studies here at Fairleigh Dickinson University, and I'm pleased to be joined today by the students in my media ethics class. We are fortunate at FDU to not only be neighbors of the United Nations, but friends as well. By means of introduction, I offer the following words from Thomas Jefferson, written in a letter to Francis Gilmer in 1816. Our legislators are not sufficiently apprised of the rightful limits of their powers, that their true office is to declare and enforce only our natural rights and duties, and to take none of them from us. No man has a natural right to commit aggression on the equal rights of another, and this is all from which the laws ought to restrain him. Every man is under the natural duty of contributing to the necessities of the society, and this is all the laws should enforce on him. And no man having a natural right to be the judge between himself and another, it is his natural duty to submit to the umbrage of an impartial third. When the laws have declared and enforced all this, they have fulfilled their functions, and the idea is quite unfounded that on entering into society we give up any natural right. The trial of every law by one of these texts would lessen much the labors of our legislators and lighten equally our municipal codes. Fairleigh Dickinson University is pleased to host this program, and we welcome our fellow colleges and universities to this discussion. I will read a list of the participants, and I ask each to note the order in which their name appears, as that will be the order in which questions are asked at the end of the session. First, Bronx Community College. Second, Lock Haven University. Third, Long Island University, Brooklyn. Fourth, Long Island University Fifth, next, Mercy College. Next, Skidmore College. Next, FDU Vancouver. Next, FDU Madison. Next, FDU Metro. We are honored to have as our moderator today Ambassador Ahmad Kamal. Ambassador Kamal served for 40 years in Pakistan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, holding diplomatic posts in India, Belgium, France, the USSR, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, and the UN, where he held positions of the highest order, including Vice President of the General Assembly. He is a senior fellow of the UN Institute of Training and Research and president of the UN Ambassadors Club. Please welcome Ambassador Kamal and our distinguished guest.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to be with you and with all the other universities that are listening in today. And a greater pleasure to have as our distinguished panelist, Mr. Huffinus, whom I will introduce in somewhat greater depth, and Ms. Sekhri, who is a research fellow at Columbia University. Mr. Huffinus comes from Civicus, which is a very important NGO, watching the United Nations rather carefully, particularly in the field of human rights. But more important than Civicus is Mr. Huffinus, whose list of qualities and posts held is so long that we will run out of time in an hour and a half if I was to start listing them all. But suffice to say that there is an NGO Action Committee on Sustainable Development, which he is watching carefully. There is a post-2015 planning group of NGOs, of which he is a member. He is the former chairman of the DPI NGO committee. He's an advisor to the Coalition for the International Criminal Court and the president of religious NGOs accredited to the United Nations. So this is a person of many virtues and many qualities. Ms. Sekhri, as I told you, has been a research fellow, is a research fellow at Columbia, and has been a consultant with the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, and is a person who helps out in keeping us on the straight and narrow whenever we waver in the work that we try to do at the United Nations. With their permission and with yours, let me lead into the subject myself. The United Nations is currently going through a critically important and decisive period of its history. It is decisive because questions are being asked on the street about the relevance of the United Nations, about its relevance in conflicts, about its relevance in economic development, about its relevance in human rights, and about its relevance in all the other matters, including climate change. And those questions about its relevance, if you push them back to find the root cause lies in the first three words of the United Nations Charter, which says, "We the peoples." And having said that, the rest of the UN Charter does not talk about peoples at all. It talks only about member states. And so the work of the United Nations is done by governments of member states. Now, it just so happens that almost all governments, whether they are in democracies or dictatorship, almost all governments are non-representative of the totality of the peoples. In the best of democracies, they represent 51%. In the worst of dictatorships, they represent 2%. But almost all governments, whether democracies or dictatorships, are oligarchies. In communist countries, that oligarchy is the Politburo. In democracies, that oligarchy is the top 2%. But that is the reality of governments around the world. And so it becomes critically important to bring in the non-governmental organizations, because the non-governmental organizations then become the conscience of the people. Since the governments are not the conscience, so the conscience is represented by civil society. And that is why it is critically important to listen to civil society and NGOs and give them participation in the decision-making process of multilateralism as defined by the United Nations. The problem is that governments don't like NGOs. They don't like NGOs because governments have power. And to like NGOs means to share power. And governments do not like to share power. And so we have a major problem, because whether the NGOs are civil society, as Civicus and Mr. Huffines, or whether civil society is academia, as Ms. Sekhri at Columbia and all of you at the 9 universities in front of us, basically the interaction is poor to non-existent. And so I'd like to open this by giving the floor to Mr. Huffines to ask him, how do you go to sleep at night knowing that the United Nations is constantly pushing you back? I know that you are conducting a jihad for the past 68 years to try to get the UN to understand the importance of civil society. But you know, as I know, that the role of civil society has, as far as the UN is concerned, been slowly diminishing. And so, how do you intend to improve that role? Because you are, as far as I'm concerned, sitting at the apex of how the United Nations will perform in future. The floor is yours, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Kamal, for that very generous introduction and also for setting the framework for this discussion. I might add that one would not expect that an ambassador of such long standing as yours, as yourself, is such a radical. But indeed, maybe this is what happens to an individual who's had the privilege of bearing witness and participating in the United Nations for several decades now. Thank you very much, again, for your introduction. Just a quick word about Civicus. Civicus, World Alliance for Citizen Participation. We are an international alliance of civil society working to strengthen citizen action and civil society throughout the world, especially in areas where participatory democracy and citizens' freedom of action are challenged. We have a vision of a global community of active, engaged citizens committed to the creation of a more just and equitable world. And this is based on the belief that the health of societies exists in direct proportion to the degree of balance between the state, private sector, and civil society, and that governance is improved when there are multiple means of people to have a say in decision making. So, Ambassador Kamal, when you talk about decision making and you talk about the role of the UN, I think a critical element that you are pointing to in terms of a repeated crisis that is a part of our international community is one of imbalance, or more particularly of an imbalance between the power of state, the private sector, and of civil society. You had mentioned three key words to be found in the United Nations Charter: we the peoples. And that is a phrase that is loaded with history. First of all, one could ask, why are NGOs or non-governmental organizations in civil society at the United Nations in the first place? And I would posit that one reason why is because the framers of the United Nations looked at the failures of the League of Nations, which was established at the turn of the 20th century following World War I, and they realized that one reason why the League of Nations failed, among several, was because the League of Nations was, strictly speaking, only and exclusively a club of member states or governments where there was little to no access by citizens and citizen groups to the League of Nations. When you take a look at the record of international relations over the centuries, and let's just take the 20th century as an example, it's rather unfortunate to recognize that the evolution of international relations and the relations among nations is a record of carnage and unparalleled world wars and massacres. And it seems that this is the only way that humanity moves forward in developing international mechanisms of collective security and of development. And so the United Nations was actually, in 1945, a rather profound development in the collective organization of nations. And the framers recognized that if the United Nations was to endure from one generation to the next, it would require not only the support of governments, but the popular support of the people through non-governmental organizations. And so in this respect, the United Nations can be seen as resting as a stool resting on three pillars: the pillar of governments, the pillar of the UN Secretariat, and the pillar of non-state actors such as civil society organizations, academia, and the private sector. I would say, as you point out, NGOs or civil society is not always the most popular leg of the stool, if you will, at least among some member states. And the reason why is because civil society, in many respects, represents the conscience of humanity, whereby we seek to uphold governments to not only the ideals of the United Nations, but to the legal obligations that member states have committed themselves, particularly in the arena of human rights. First, with the founding of the UN Declaration on Human Rights, and then subsequently in the formulation of the human rights treaties, the international conventions on social, economic, and cultural rights, and civil and political rights, together with the many different conventions articulating rights for women, for children, against racial discrimination, against torture, against genocide, and other forms of discrimination. So one of the things that I look forward to speaking, to talking to the students about as we continue our conversation is our more recent work with regard to sustainable development. Just to move forward into history, in the early 1990s, beginning in 1992, the United Nations organized a series of global conferences, the first one being on sustainable development in Rio in 1992, followed by global conferences on human rights in Vienna, on population and development in Cairo, on women in Beijing, and on human settlements in Istanbul. And so these conferences together created plans of action and political commitments and a wide variety of issues and challenges confronting humanity. And these were followed then by the year 2000. And as you had indicated in one of our conversations just before meeting the students, why is it that we seem to be in love with numbers? Well, not just as the United Nations, but as human beings. And I think many of us will recall the excitement leading up to the new millennium. And the United Nations created a Millennium Declaration where they recommitted themselves to the values of the UN and committed themselves to the 8 Millennium Development Goals, which has been a primary focus of the United Nations, of member states, as well as NGOs, up through this present time. And now the United Nations is in the process of going through a rather, I would say, complex, if not elaborate, sort of exercise whereby they are seeking to frame and establish a new set of global development goals. And as our conversation goes forward, we can go into more detail about that development.
Thank you very much. Ms. Sekhri, you're at Columbia, working with Jeffrey Sachs and others, including the former Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. And the work that you are doing is also very closely motivated towards improving the multilateral system. You are and have been a practicing lawyer in Britain. So how do you see the United Nations and the role of the civil society in the United Nations, particularly academia? Because we have a whole setup called the Academic Impact, which you read about. What is yours?
Mr. Kamal, in terms of the role of civil society, there is definitely a big change happening now in terms of the power and the influence civil society can have on government organizations, and that's just through sheer connectedness and technology. Their voices are a lot more able to be heard. I mean, 30 years ago, if you had an opinion, not many people would know about it, whereas now the whole world can know about it in a matter of seconds. But I do agree with Ambassador Kamal that there is a disconnect between civil society and the voices they have and the forums they have to have those voices with an actual impact in creating change, in influencing government structures to act differently. So I think that's where academia or institutions like Columbia University and the Earth Institute we have there really come in, where there's resources, there's relationships. I think civil society cannot really function on its own. There are current institutions and governance in place, and the best way for civil society to have an impact is to actually be directly connected to those organizations. And at Columbia, Jeffrey Sachs heads up the Earth Institute, which has a very close relationship with the United Nations here. They worked incredibly closely on developing the MDG and now the post-MDG agenda. And I think the advantages that civil society through academia offer is that it just isn't opinions, it's backed up by resources, by research, by facts, which then can be communicated through the relationships they have. But I think, even though all this progress is made and academia is a great forum, there still is a disconnect between the opinions and wants of civil society and actually what government structures or government organizations do. But I think that takes us to my final point, and the question that remains is, well, how much impact does civil society really have? Governance structures are in place for a reason. We elected our officials to run our countries, and they have a lot of different things to take into account, and we've trusted that with them. So should there be kind of a mob democracy like we've seen in the Middle East, where it's very easy to spark a change through civil society when you want a revolution, but in terms of continuing that and getting the actual change or shift you want, you need the support of institutions. So putting that question out there.
Mr. Fines, other than the disconnect between civil society and governments in the United Nations, the multilateral system suffers from a second disease, which is that it is supposed to be based on rule of law, that is to say, a charter, a constitution, legal norms, which are constantly being improved in resolutions, etc. But in actual fact, what is happening is not rule of law, rule of power. That is to say, a certain number of countries are determining the course of action of the United Nations in total ignorance of the vast majority of the populations of the world, whether in numbers or in numbers of countries. And so this disconnect between rule of law and rule of power, how do you intend to bridge this as Civicus? Floor is yours.
Well, you bring up a very good point, and you bring up I would say, a fundamental tension, if not contradiction, in the heart of all levels of governance in human society today, whether you're a democracy or not. Just as a very concrete example of, let's say, the democratic deficit at the United Nations, let us not forget that there are 5 members of the UN Security Council that have a veto. They have veto power, which means that if there is any decision or resolution that they do not like, one of these 5 member states are at liberty to veto it. So regardless of any element of majority rule, the Security Council, which is the only organ of the United Nations that has enforcement capacity, is very limited in a democratic sense. Indeed, when you take a look at the membership of the Security Council as an example, one would argue, and indeed you yourself have been a party to the interminable, endless negotiations of member states in terms of the reform of the Security Council, so that it may more accurately reflect the power dynamics that exist today and not those that existed back in 1945 following World War II. But be that as it may, I would say that there have been some fundamental changes. There's been an evolution in the engagement of civil society at the United Nations since its founding. When you look back at the non-governmental organizations that then existed, let's say in the 1950s, first of all, there were only a few dozen. There weren't thousands. Secondly, the role of civil society, or NGOs, during that time was largely ceremonial. But beginning in the 60s into the 70s, and then as I had mentioned previously in the 1990s, there was a veritable explosion, a proliferation of NGOs, and the United Nations at that time was opening its doors to the participation of NGOs in these conferences. Moreover, in 1992, at the Conference on Environmental Development in Rio, there was a blueprint for sustainable development, Agenda 21, which was agreed to by member states, whereby 9 major groups of society were recognized to be able to play an official role in this new institution they had then created, the Commission on Sustainable Development. And these 9 major groups of society, or 9 major groups as they are now called, include science, business and industry, women, children, local authorities, NGOs, indigenous peoples. And I find that this development has been significant, and the opportunities for civil society engagement through these 9 different constituencies has offered an opportunity for the diversity of the voices of civil society to be heard, and the role of the major groups continues today in the post-2015 development agenda.
Thank you very much. I have one more question to ask before we open it to questions from the universities. As you know, I have chaired a large number of NGO meetings or been a keynote speaker at NGO meetings. And whenever I have the NGOs in front of me, at a time, I find that they are very white in color. Their skin color is white. Now, it just so happens that the majority of the world is not white. It is black or brown or yellow or to some extent green. Those who are Irish are green in color. So what I want to know is, how does this white skin permeate the whole of the NGO kingdom to the exclusion of all the others? Where are the other colors in the NGOs? Back to you, sir.
Well, I'd have to look in the mirror here. I think I'm being accused, perhaps. No, but I would say, first of all, of course, I represent an international alliance that's based in Africa. And so I can assure you that Civicus, as well as many other international NGOs, local NGOs from around the world, are also in the global south. But you bring up one point which I think is of common concern among both civil society, but also with, of course, governments, and that is, how can we bring the voices of the voiceless and the voice of those who are not able to come to New York from around the world, but particularly from the global south, how can we bring them into the halls of power so that their voices are represented as well? And of course, it requires resources. And then this requires a commitment on the part of member states to actually resource the participation of their own NGOs. And rather ironically, as you may know, Ambassador, as I know you know, Ambassador Kamal, the very governments who often complain the most about not having their own NGOs represented at the UN are the very same governments who really don't want the NGOs at the United Nations at all. So again, this is where we go back to, let's say, some of the tensions and challenges that NGOs have in dealing with member states and dealing with that fundamental power dynamic that exists among all the different actors here at the UN.
That is not quite correct. When I chaired the NGO Council for years, the main problems that I had were not with the countries from the south, but with the countries from the north, who were most vociferous in talking about their support to the NGOs, but who did not want the NGOs to come anywhere near the United Nations. They are the ones who are preventing the NGOs from coming deeper into the United Nations, not the people, not the countries of the South. So I don't want to name the countries because of the lightness of the soil to the soil on which we stand, but difficulties were faced here during those consultations. You have said that opening it out to the world, but you recognize that the world is important. 3/4 of the world is out of our purview here. It does not require resources now. The information technology is now so good and so cheap. In fact, it costs nothing. Here we are talking to 9 universities and it is costing us nothing because we are with voice over IP as the protocol. And the NSA can watch every conversation anywhere in the world. Why can't the NGOs also bring in all the outsiders using information technology? What you need is a network of NGOs at the United Nations whose job will be only to further the use of information technology so that participation is total and costless. It does not cost resources, it costs energy. Back to you, sir.
Here, here. I can only agree with your recommendation, and indeed there are international networks of NGOs who are doing their best to harness communications technology. But I would agree we can certainly be doing a much better job, and all I can do is applaud your statement, and certainly we look forward to utilizing these technologies in a better way.
Ms. Secretary.
I think I just want to add in, like going back to my final point, we should really consider to what extent does civil society have the right and should play a role in governance and decisions made at the UN and on a governmental level. I mean, there's a saying, too many cooks spoil the soup. Broth?
Right.
The broth. And I can understand why there would be resistance to opening up the forum to non-governmental organizations. The work of the UN and the work of governments is hard enough, just trying to coordinate everything they have to, and then to have an inflow of other organizations and voices to consider. I go back to my point that governments and the UN are made up of elected and people chosen to represent their countries.
We'll open it up for questions now, starting with 2 questions from Bronx to come together, followed by 2 questions from Lockhaven. Bronx, you have the floor.
Bronx is out, they have no attendance. So we move to Lockhaven.
Okay, Lockhaven, 2 questions, followed by Long Island, Brooklyn.
My name is Alicia Govins, and I'm a political science international relations major, and I'm a senior. And my question is, how do we join together the definitions of development between the global north and south? Because currently they're not the same.
Second question.
If not, I'll follow up with one. Good morning. I will ask a question just because recently I know our university, and I'm Dr. Whitling, the director of the honors program, and we, as other schools, have been moving towards a revision in our general education, one component being a global awareness and citizenship requirement, 9 credits. And so I was just wondering, Mr. Huffines, or any of you, if there was an ideal class that would really help to educate the citizenship and a global awareness to students. Would there be a particular course in mind that you could perceive? Because we're still trying to define what some of these courses will be.
Thank you. Very good questions. Mr. Huffines, you take them first. I have a point of view, but I don't want to spoil your your energy.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your kindness, Ambassador Kamal. I appreciate that. So the first question from Alicia was, how do we join together the definitions of development between North and South? Which is an excellent question. In fact, this is a question that's being debated quite vigorously here at the United Nations now at an entity called the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development. At the 20th anniversary conference of Rio, the Conference on Environment and Development called Rio Plus 20, the member states agreed to establish an open working group on sustainable development goals. These sustainable development goals are the global goals intended to succeed the Millennium Development Goals. And one of the key issues that is being debated is the notion of sustainable consumption and production. And what this means is that those countries or countries engaged in industrial development have a commitment whereby they should not exceed the planetary boundaries of the environment. For example, carbon dioxide and climate change is an example of a tipping point whereby the planetary boundaries are being exceeded. And one of the things that we know is that, for example, here in the United States, which has about 5% of the population, yet it's responsible for over 25% of the consumption of the world. So one of our challenges as a global economy is that as different countries emerge into take on greater industrial development, and take China for example, it largely when it's opened its economy, it looked to the United States as a primary model of economic development. And yet one of the challenges is that if all the people of the world were to achieve the same level of consumption as Americans or as Europeans, it would exceed the capacity of the Earth 2 or 3, 4 or 5 times. Already we need a planet and a half in order to accommodate the consumption patterns of the developed world. So this is one of the challenges in terms of the definition of development between the North or and the South, or between, let's say, least developed countries and countries of the OECD. What we need to do in the developed world is to reduce dramatically our levels of consumption, whereas the peoples in the least developed countries, they need to enjoy the benefits of economic development so that they can have a standard of a lifestyle comprised of dignity based upon human rights.
I have a major problem with what Mr. Hafeins has said. I do not understand the meaning of the word sustainable development at all. I understand the word development. I do not understand why it is necessary to add an adjective to that noun. From 1945 to 1990, the debate in the United Nations was about development, because we knew that the gap between the rich and the poor is enormous and that it is doubling every 40 years. And so the requirement was development, and development was defined as a movement of money, and the figure of 0.7% of GDP of the rich countries to be transferred onto a basket on the table was the mantra of the United Nations. But the developed countries were not willing to put their money where their mouth was. That was the problem. They said 0.7%, which was a consensus resolution of the United Nations, but the actual amount given was 1/3 of that amount. And the richest country in the world, nameless as always, gave only 1/5 of that amount. And so if you don't put money where your mouth is, I'm sorry, you're not going to have development. And so the pressure was on the developed countries. And in order to take that pressure off, they suddenly discovered something called the environment and something called human rights. And this is the new agenda of the United Nations, and it came into the front burner only from 1990 onwards, because in 1990, the balance in the world was destroyed by the end of the Cold War, and so the new agenda could take off. But that is not the problem of the world. We have a country like India, which is 1.2 billion people. 600 million people in India, 600 million, that is to say, half the population of the country is living on less than 30 cents a day. The United Nations definition of abject poverty is $1.25 a day. Half of India is living on 1/4 of that definition. And that is India, which is a middle income country. You go to Africa, and Mr. Civicus knows Africa well. People are eating grass and berries in Africa. They're not interested in the environment. They're interested in hunger and starvation. And so, I'm sorry, there's a lot of talk about sustainable development, but not enough talk about development as such. Give us development and sustainability will come automatically. We will not make the mistakes that developed countries have made, because their mistake is overconsumption. The problem in the United States, look at me and look at Mr. Hafines. My bones are sticking out. I am on the verge of starvation, and Mr. Hafines represents the overconsumption, obesity of the United States, Western world. You want me to show them what you look like, or shall we go on to?
I have a much nicer looking person over.
Okay, let's go for the nicer looking person, because she's working with Jeffrey Sachs, who is also very interested in this subject.
So I'd just like to add, there is a dichotomy to what Ambassador Kamal is saying about the word development and whether it can be sustainable. I think it's just common sense that it has to be sustainable. For example, in Africa, Nigeria is now Africa's top economy. Rwanda last year was one of the fastest economies of the whole world. It's projected by 2050, Nigeria's population will surpass the USA's. So the world is growing, technology is growing, but industry is also growing. And there has to be a way to mitigate pollution and mitigate negative effects for human life on this planet. And I think China is an interesting example, which kind of follows Ambassador Kamal's point on how development and the sustainability will follow. So China's had an immense revolution over the last 20 years, pulled out a vast number of its population out of poverty, but now they're really focusing on their pollution issues and the residues of what it has become, what their industrialization has done to their country. My friends who are from Shanghai say you cannot breathe in Shanghai, but China is now, it's an important country to watch at how and whether they are successful in bringing sustainability back into the process there.
Mr. Hafine, you are the president of the religious NGOs, and there is a question about religion. Please, back to you.
I had been the president of the Committee of Religious NGOs a number of years ago, and this is a committee that is comprised of representatives of organizations of faith-based communities from around the world. And what the Committee of Religious NGOs seeks to do is to consider the ethical perspective of the issues confronting the United Nations, and also to highlight the spiritual traditions of humanity and identify those areas of common values so that the people of different faith traditions can come together and work together along lines of common action in support of United Nations programs and specialized agencies such as UNICEF, the UNFPA, and UNDP.
Thank you very much. Two questions from Long Island, Brooklyn, followed by Mercy.
Good afternoon. My name is Mo Balaji. I'm a graduate student here at LIU, and I guess we just wanted to know how can we increase NGO representation at the UN that includes students from a variety of countries, like in a positive way that actually makes us more proactive, like students, because we are the future of tomorrow. And instead of building new houses with old stones, how do we old bricks? How do we implement new students, like students into NGO programs where they're effectively represented?
You are not the students of tomorrow, the UN of tomorrow. You are the UN of today. Because great things have been done by young people below the age of 20. And so you don't have to wait till tomorrow in order to play a role. There is a project called the Academic Impact, and Long Island University is a part of that project. And the idea is to have a special status for academia, which is accredited as an NGO, but to give them special status in the work of the United Nations. And so participate in those meetings, come forward with ideas, and implement those ideas. But Mr. Magnus?
Well, that's great. That's a great advice, Ambassador Kamal. I would also add that Fairleigh Dickinson University, FDU, is itself an example that other colleges may wish to follow, in that they're, I believe, the first university, or certainly one of the first universities, to be officially accredited to the United Nations. And so by so doing, they give their students an opportunity to have a direct relationship with the United Nations. Now, in terms of student participation with NGOs around the world and here at the United Nations, of course, there are a variety of internship programs that you might wish to consider. Also, in terms of formal participation at the United Nations, within the framework of the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, and currently with the Open Working Group, there is the 9 major groups of society, which include children and youth. And I would say that the children and youth major group are among the most active, both in terms of actually having a voice at the United Nations, but also in utilizing those modern communication technologies so effectively in bringing students and youth voices from around the world together, around the globe here at the UN.
Let's go to Mercy. Mercy for 2 questions from Mercy.
Hi, I'm from Mercy College. I have only one question because the student had to leave for their class, so I'm the only one sitting here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay.
We can hear you.
So my question is, like you are telling about India, like I'm from India and I'm studying here as an international student. So what would you suggest for the underdeveloped countries, people, or maybe the underdeveloped countries to get success in this tough environment right now?
This is an important question. It is important because it is quite clear that we are not really succeeding. Despite all your talk about sustainable development, etc., the basic problem is that the developmental problem of the world is a macro problem, and you need macro funds for that. And macro funds are not forthcoming. And people are talking of micro funds, and micro funds are not going to resolve the problem. And so, how are we going to generate the surplus? Now, there are only three ways of generating the response to poverty. Those three ways are either direct foreign assistance, which is ODA, which is not coming, or foreign direct investment, which is not coming either because it is only going from the rich countries to the rich countries. Or the third real formula is trade. And trade comes up either against subsidies or against low commodity prices. And that's just not on. You go into Starbucks for a cup of coffee, it costs you $3. The coffee in it is coming from Colombia, and the Colombian farmer is getting only 7 cents out of that cup of coffee. And so, how can we improve commodity prices in the world, which would then automatically enable the global south to improve itself?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your question. It's an excellent question. And, following up on Ambassador Kamal's comments, I would say that the voices that perhaps offer the most radical critique of the neoliberal model of the global economy come from our colleagues, our NGOs from the global south, where they insist that the dominant economic model of globalization and the free market policies must be transformed and reformed because it disproportionately benefits the corporate sector, especially transnational corporations. And in that regard, we all know that the financing requirements for sustainable development or for development is enormous, but the resources are there. So, for example, just 5% of the $45 trillion wealth of the world's high net worth individuals is enough to cover the annual cost of global social protection for climate change adaptation and mitigation combined. And yet, only a small proportion and a declining proportion of available finance is being invested in the real economy, let alone poverty eradication and environmental protection. So one of our challenges on the macroeconomic level is to convince governments to take the reins, if you will, of regulation and follow through on developing an economic model developed upon human rights and fair play.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Skidmore for 2 questions from Skidmore.
Thank you, Ambassador Kamal. Our first question is from Patrick Babbitt.
Hi. If not sustainability, what alternative framework should be used to guide development to be truly long-term and broad-based?
Okay.
Thank you.
And our second question is, the Millennium Development Goals had very specific targets with measurable milestones, which made it easier for countries to come to consensus. Yet there were problems with progress and achieving targets. What are the specific targets of the civil society-led bottom-up approach to sustainable development, and whether will you have a specific deadline like 2015? Thank you.
Mr. Fine, you can take both questions, but on the first one, I don't understand the long term because there was a great phrase in English which said, in the long term, we're all dead. And so, forget the long term. Let's work in the short term. That is what interests us. Local time, local space. Forget the long term. But over to you because you believe in the long term.
Well, thank you very much for that. Unlike Ambassador Kamal, I don't have an argument against sustainable development. So in terms of the alternative model, what I'd like to suggest is, let's go back to one of the original definitions of sustainable development found in the Brundtland Report, which is sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It contains within it 2 key concepts. The concept of needs, in particular the essential needs of the world's poor, to which overriding priority should be given, and two, the idea of limitations imposed by the state of technology and social organization on the environment's ability to meet present and future needs. Now, when you look at needs and the essential needs of the world's poor as an overriding priority, let's not kid ourselves. We have a global economy that is not devoted to taking care of the needs of the poorest. It's devoted to taking care of the needs of the richest and making sure that the richest get ever richer. And so in that regard, we have a global economy that is in fundamental disrepair in that sense. So there are a number of goals and targets that NGOs have recommended within the context of this debate about the Sustainable Development Goals with regard to governance, with regard to human rights, with regard to having fair taxation on global financial transactions, with regard to dealing with illicit tax evasion and illicit economic flows. And so there's a number of very specific targets that we could share with you offline in terms of the development of these new global development goals.
I think there was a question also about the MDGs. How are they working out? Why are they not working out?
I'd like to ask if our colleague could perhaps respond to that.
The MDGs, in actual fact, not great progress has been made. A lot of the figures are skewed by the work that's been done in China and India, the economics and the industrial progress made there over the last 10 years, which has not very much to do with the actual MDG movement and the systems that were put in place around there. But what I can speak to is what the MDGs have actually, like I worked in Rwanda for many years, what they've done in terms of creating aspiration, creating a belief. Rwanda's own internal policy, they made up a plan called Vision 2020. By 2020, they have their own targets of education, health, food systems. So what the MDG has really been successful at is galvanizing countries which are ready to be galvanized to set their own targets and be inspired that poverty can be eradicated. And I think first putting that concept out there has been a really important positive thing made by the MDGs, but there is much progress to be made.
The basic problem of the MDGs is the following. They are more of a wish list than an action list. And when you have a wish list, it has to be backed by adequate political will. And the political will was never there. You need a political will which is global in nature. We have political will which is national in nature. But national interests are not going to create a better world. You need a global interest. And that political will was never there for the MDGs. And that is why the MDGs are not going to be fulfilled by the year 2015. The second problem of the MDGs is that if you don't have political will, you must have spiritual underpinnings. And this ties to the question which was asked earlier about religion. You must have spiritual underpinnings in decision making. But if your underpinnings are based on love of money, then that's not a spiritual underpinning. And therefore, you are not going to achieve the basis of the MDGs without political will and without spiritual underpinnings. And now the question which I would like to address to Mr. Hafines is, the MDGs we know are not going to succeed by 2015. You are in the middle of drafting a new document called the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. How are you confident that the SDGs will face a better future than the MDGs? Back to you, sir.
Well, I would say that certainly there's no guarantee on anything in this sense. However, one of the lessons learned from the experience of the MDGs that's being applied currently in the development of the Sustainable Development Goals is that the MDGs were largely crafted here at the United Nations at UN headquarters and was, some would argue, imposed upon the governments of the world. And so in this go-around, member states, particularly members of the G77, were determined that history would not repeat itself, and they wanted to make sure that there was a thorough consultation in the development of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so during the past year and a half or so, there has, following Rio Plus 20, there has been sustained consultation through this open working group on Sustainable Development Goals by member states, but also the United Nations has invited citizens from around the world to engage in a series of almost 100 national consultation and 11 thematic consultations. Moreover, there's been a number of surveys that have been conducted and continuing conversations throughout the world on a global basis, so that the inputs of not only governments and member states, but the inputs of United Nations agencies and citizens from around the world are gathered together, so that we hope that what we will be able to create in this go-around are goals that are applicable and universal to all countries around the world, and not just social goals that apply to developing countries.
But Mr. Huffines, we know the problem. We don't need consultation about the problem. We need money on the table. Where's the money? Where's the beef in the sandwich? That's what I want to know. Has your consultation produced beef for the sandwich?
Well, I mean, this is, I would say, to use a cliche, the million-dollar question before us, because the big debate in these consultations at the United Nations is means of implementation, and whether or not the countries of the developed world will actually deliver on their promises to assist countries in the developing world to have the means in order to achieve these lofty goals and to eradicate poverty.
But you realize that the world is going through a recession. And in a period of recession, nobody is willing to put money on the table. And people are therefore tired. Everybody is under budgetary difficulties, even in the developed world. And so it's not a good time to talk about a new vision for the world. Visions are good when you are in a period of increase, but when you are in a period of depression, then I'm sorry, and recession, then that's not a good time to plan the future. But that being said, let's go on to Fairleigh Dickinson at Vancouver for 2 questions from Vancouver.
Hi, good morning.
Hi.
My question is to Mr. Huffines. He talks about voice and voiceless people in other parts of the country. So my question is, exploitation of human resources in India and Bangladesh and natural resources in Africa, what good is UN doing to give their silence a voice? And also, is it ethical for the Western world to pollute the environment in the name of outsourcing and so-called giving the employment to the other parts of the world?
Second question.
I think that was.
Just a second.
Good morning. My question is, if the United Nations wasn't able to achieve the Millennium Development Goals, don't you think that by saying the Sustainable Development Goals, it will be just a distraction to reach the ones said before? As Ambassador said, if we work on development, then sustainability will be reached indirectly too. Nevertheless, my question is, if the goals are not to be achieved in 2015, then when?
voice of the silent. Very important question, because do we have a procedure to reach out to the silent people in the world in a time of information technology, and most importantly at a time of Twitter? Twitter has changed the world because it has given a voice to the voiceless. How is Twitter being used, meaning social media being used? It can overthrow governments. Why can't it overthrow poverty? I'm much more interested in overthrowing poverty than in overthrowing governments. Over to you, sir.
Well, I wish I was an expert in the use of social media. I've got to admit I am not. However, it is an amazing development whereby it seems that the majority of the peoples around the world, regardless of their income status, has a cell phone. And so it's been in continents like Africa where the innovative uses of the cell phone, as an example, and not only in terms of Twitter, but in terms of the fundamental banking technology and of things of this nature is being developed. With regard to the use of human resources and natural resources and the responsibility of the North or the West in exporting their pollution, I mean, I think this is a genuine concern among NGOs across the board. And in fact, one of the fundamental principles that's in debate with regard to these Sustainable Development Goals is the notion of common but differentiated responsibilities, whereby those countries in the West who have been the most responsible for the industrial creation of pollution and the consequences of climate change should also bear a proportionate responsibility in helping to clean up the mess, particularly when oftentimes climate change has an impact on those people in other parts of the world who are least responsible for the problem. So this is an ongoing debate and a cause of real concern among NGOs. And in terms of the MDGs and the achievement of the MDGs, I'd like to turn it to Ms. Sikre if she could respond to that in the context of the SDGs.
No, but before she takes on the MDGs, I want to comment on this voice to the voiceless question. Because the impression that I got was that somebody has to give voice to the voiceless. I don't agree. I think the voiceless can take voice themselves. Mm-hmm. They don't have to wait for voice to be given to them. You have the most powerful tools at your disposal now. Internet, Twitter, social media. This is extraordinary, absolutely unique tools. And so use them. What are you waiting for? Why are you waiting for people like me, old fogies who have no interest in giving you a voice? Because I have power. Why would I want to share power with you? It is for you to take the power yourself. And so stand up and revolt and take power. That is what is expected of you. And so just don't wait. You have referred in your question to India and Bangladesh. Bangladesh has done absolute wonders in economic development. It is unique, the achievements of Bangladesh. For example, in population control, all of us have a problem because we are developing countries, which means that there is not enough electricity available, which means the nights are long, which means that we do what we can do best, which is to produce children during the night. And that means that you can have a growth rate of above 3%. Bangladesh has succeeded in bringing it down to 1.8%. How did it do it? It did it by using the power of the people. And the government helping the power of the people. It didn't wait for the United Nations population planning activities to come and teach it how to cut down the birth rate. The same activities are there in Pakistan. Pakistan is still at 3.5 and Bangladesh is at 1.8. And so stand up and do it. Don't wait for me to come and help you. I'm not going to come and help you.
Just a point on the MDGs and the fact that they haven't done well or will not be met. That doesn't come to natural conclusions that why should we continue, why should there be an SDG? I think the MDGs themselves represent very fundamental concepts and agreements. There is no reason why anyone should be starving on this planet. We have abundant resources. So I don't think it's an option for them just to dissolve away because achieving them has been difficult. I think perhaps the best option would have been just to continue and extend the deadline by another 10, 15 years. But the SDG agendas come in now, and it's a lot more about extending. It's about adding things that were missed in the MDGs. So very core things which are very related to development, such as women's rights, women equality, economic creation, job creation. Those weren't in the initial MDGs. And I think there has been a learning process that's happened, and now these are being updated to bring in the other aspects which perhaps led to the slow progress.
Over to Ellie Dickinson at Madison for 2 questions from Madison.
Yes. Okay. My question is for Ms. Sekhri. You stated earlier that you questioned the extent to which civil society should be involved in the UN. And you said that governments in the UN are made of people, those who are elected to represent their countries. But I have somewhat of a problem with that, because often governments aren't very representative of their countries. You look at Saudi Arabia, which is a very repressive government. You look at, for example, the United States, which, while we do vote politicians, yes, they are owned lock, stock, and barrel by corporations. And so your question of whether, kind of, in your opinion, if we go and probably decrease the amount of civil society involved in the UN or in governments, then where would the people have a voice?
Yeah, I just want to thank you for the question. I want to clarify that point. It's a question that I'm raising in terms of just practical, how do you govern, how do you make decisions? And I agree with you, there's many countries where their governance structures are not democratic or representative, and civil society does have an incredibly important role. But I guess the question to really be raised is to what extent. I don't suggest it be decreased. I mean, we've all agreed that. We've all agreed that there isn't the translation of impact in civil society and its opinions and the results that are formed at the governance level. So I certainly wouldn't advocate decreasing it, but I can empathize why government structures are cautious of letting more NGOs into their decision-making process. Or I think perhaps there needs to be a different way of structuring it so it's more organized and it's more helpful. And that's why I think something like the Earth Institute or academia, where it's not just an opinion, it's an opinion backed by a group of people who have resources, who have done research, and who have the relationships to make that change.
I'll ask you for a second question from Madison, but before that, on this point, I think there is an over fascination with the concept of democracy in our thinking process. What is necessary is not democratic governance, but good governance. And good governance does not necessarily have to be democratic governance. Our distinguished professor at TNEC read out a quote from one of the founding fathers of the United States. Go back to 1750 BC. I repeat, 1750 BC, when a dictator by the name of Hammurabi came out with the first code of laws. that is recorded. And he starts these code of laws by saying, I, Hammurabi, hereby enact these laws so that justice may prevail in the kingdom and the strong may not oppress the weak. This is Hammurabi writing in 1750 BC. Not a democracy, and yet what a great code of laws, which is one of the fundamental code of laws in when you study the concept of rule of law. And so let's not get carried away by democracy. The objective should be good governance. And if you can achieve good governance by other means, fine, so be it. Okay, over to TNEC for questions from TNEC.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Kamal. I would just say to you, Ambassador, you made one of the most telling comments of this conference. In the long term, we're all dead, which is in fact no one would take exception to. However, the only thing I would say, perhaps in support of Mr. Huffiness's position, is really quoting from the indigenous peoples address to the United Nations in the 1990s, when they reminded us that their society was built on the thought of 7 generations. And what we do today must be done in the thought of what effect it has on 7 generations hence. Not only are they not dead, they're not even born yet. And it is perhaps a change of thinking that may be called for. Our 2 questions are from our students, Gerald Parsons and Melanie Reyes. Gerald?
Yes, so Mr. Huffiness, my question is towards you, Mr. Huffiness, and is, what is the best method an individual can do to help motivate others to assist the SDG process?
Individual, second question.
And Melanie?
My question is for Ms. Sakri. Has the media played a part in giving the voices to the NGOs, to civic societies, and to civic US? And is the media's participation welcomed? And by media, I mean the news agencies like newspapers and the news networks.
Mr. Huffiness, the first question.
Yes, very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, and that is to say, in terms of what can the individual do, I would say the best thing that we can do as individuals is to participate in the consultations, participate in the process. And there are several opportunities to do this, both in terms of the current consultations now ongoing with the Open Working Group, through the major groups, through other stakeholders, through the World We Want platform, which is a UN civil society website devoted to collaboration between the United Nations and CSOs, where everyone who wants to have a platform, have an opportunity to present their views, to engage in conversations, to host discussion groups may do so. Moreover, once the SDGs are agreed upon, our work is not over. We then, each of us, have a responsibility to actually achieve the future global development goals, whatever they may be called, and also to participate in frameworks of accountability, whereby we hold our governments to account to the promises that they make in these goals and targets, and most importantly, in the creation of indicators at the national level, whereby we will know when these goals and targets have actually been achieved through implementation.
Ms. Sikri on the media.
Yeah, I'll very quickly take that as well. I think the media is incredibly powerful and important tool, and it's very well welcomed. And just to look at the examples of media reporting and the changes it's caused in various countries. For example, the India rape case of last year, and it was really the media that spread the international attention and also domestic attention there and have followed that through. And that has resulted in a lot of legislation being changed and tightened up in India, which has a historic and terrible relationship with women's rights and equality there. Also look at Malala, a teenager shot in Pakistan for going to school, and the impact of the media coverage on that has had on her cause.
Yes, but we must remember that the media is a business. It is not an institution which is interested either in news or even in entertainment. It is only interested in the advertisements that it can get, either through the news or through entertainment. It's a business. And so it is going to pick up whatever news or whatever entertainment can best hook the population. Because the larger the population that is hooked, the better the rates that it can charge for advertisements. And that is unfortunate, because we thought the media was there to give us the news. Not at all. It is there to sell ads. And you can see it for yourself. Watch television. On the news, a first-class program, which is Fareed Zakaria, is interrupted 4 times for long sessions for ads about different things. And in this country, this is the only country in the world which puts out ads for medicines and asks you to go and tell your doctor, please prescribe this medicine to me. No other country does this in the world. So this is not the media. This is a deformation of the media. And we must watch the media carefully so as not to be carried away by their desire to twist news and entertainment into a sales pitch. We've got about a minute left, and I would like to ask Mr. Hafinas a question, because this is a person of very great experience. If, Mr. Hafinas, if you were appointed God and you could make 3 changes in the UN, and you have some right because you are God. 3 changes, what are those 3 that you will make? 1, 2, 3. The floor is yours.
Well, if I were God, I would be able to make those recommendations immediately. But I would say that in terms of the United Nations, I would want to see the United Nations to be much more democratic in its operation, which is to say, I would eliminate the veto power in the UN Security Council. I would second. I would make UN General Assembly resolutions more than just rhetorical devices that are otherwise meaningless, but actually have some enforcement capability amongst all nations. And third, I would want to open the United Nations to all the peoples of the world, so that they feel that this is their body, their institution, and that they're a part of it.
With those words of wisdom, I leave it to you to close this session from your end.
Thank you. On behalf of the Office of Global Learning at Fairleigh Dickinson University, I would like to thank Ambassador Kamal, Mr. Hafinas, and Ms. Sekri, and our colleagues and students for participating in this conference. This is Dr. B.F. Batistoli saying so long from TNEC.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.